The anti-marshal we're going to have a look at. Well, first of all, we must show what the marshal actually is before explaining what an anti-marshal is.
So the marshal is one of the biggest challenges for white in the Ruy Lopez. Like the Berlin, it's one of those lines which is very popular at all levels, but especially at the top level, and where white has struggled to prove an advantage. And players have tried many approaches over the years. D6 leads very often to classical Sicilian, the classical Spanish.
Yeah.
Where white plays C3, castle, and H3, and this is one of the big tabias in modern chess. Where black has various approaches: knight b8, the Breyer, knight a5, the Chigorin, bishop b7, the Zaitsev, and various other lines as well. But if black wants to avoid that, there's the move castle, which is an invitation, let's say, to the marshal. Now, if white plays c3, trying to get the same positions after d6, h3, black has the option of d5, and this is the marshal gambit. So it's a very principled move. It basically forces the play, because if white doesn't take the pawn, and it's not necessary to take the pawn, you can make a move like a4, d3, then black has freed his position and has more central control. And if white takes the pawn, then black's compensation is basically based on the fact that white's kingside is suddenly devoid of defenders.
Yeah.
And black gets quick development because the rook is on e5.
And also the move c3 is somehow, well, not a waste of time, obviously, but you would love to have your knight there.
No, we can imagine that if instead of c3 the pawn was on c2, then white could play knight c3 here, trade off black's active knight, and if you simplify the position, then you have better chances of exploiting your extra pawn. Like there's theory here, for example, of d4, d3 is also bishop d6, rook e1, and we quickly see that black starts attacking the king side, g3, queen h3, and because there was no knight on f3, for example, white was forced to weaken with g3. h3 stuff, always runs into bishop takes h3. And g3, queen h3, and suddenly black has ideas of bishop g4, rook a8, attacking with tempo. That's not to say that this line isn't playable for white. This is a huge theoretical battlefield, let's say, where white has various moves: bishop e3, rook e4, stopping bishop g4 with the idea of rook h4, or queen e2, or queen f3. All viable moves, but not too popular these days because black is considered to have good theoretical chances and also a lot of attacking chances. These days, players don't really want to allow their king to be attacked.
Also, it looks like a very healthy gambit. I mean, one pawn for quick development. I mean,
I mean, these days, to us, the marshal is considered a very healthy opening, one where black has good chances not only to equalize, but to take over the initiative. The other problem with this opening from white's point of view is that there's a huge body of theory, and you have to memorize a lot. So you can prepare it well, but you're still going to have to memorize thousands of variations. Now white has other approaches. For example, white could play h3, which is the same idea. You play d6, and then white plays c3 and gets the classical Ruy Lopez. That's why black, and here d5 is not as good. Just to mention that that we see that, for example, in this position, white's pawn is not on c3, and it's just a better version. Of c6, for example, if we play d4, bishop d6, and retreat the rook, it's just going to be a better version. And possibly we can also consider knight c3 here. But after h3, black plays bishop b7, and of course c3 again will run into d5 with an improved marshal gambit. That's why d3 has been the main move, and this was a very popular theoretical battlefield as well. Very often black would play d6.
After all,
in the past, there have been thousands of games with d6, and white could choose different setups. You know, a3 is a very popular one. a4 is of course a popular one. c3, and white tries to prove that the bishop on b7 is not that well placed there. It would rather be on c8 where it can go to e6, and that's a very valid argument that white can make. The problem these days is that black still plays d5, and this is considered also to be a very healthy pawn sacrifice. After ed5, knight d5. Again, white doesn't have to take, but it's the principled move. Otherwise, black does have the center. And okay, white has tried different approaches as well, like a4 or knight d2 or c3. I've played this position from both sides, but black is considered to be doing well. And after knight e5, again, black can take, and there is a body of theory here, but knight d4 is considered an even more accurate way to get a good position. And for example, this line was played in Kariak and Carlsen in the last in their World Championship match in 2016. Both players were well prepared, and they quickly reached a drawn a forced draw, basically.
Well, again, this looks very healthy from black's point of view.
Yeah, of course. I mean, black is down a pawn, but on the other hand, you see his activity.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that even if white consolidates, black does have a lot of positional pressure. You know, we're not getting attacked immediately, but very often black gets a bishop pair. This knight starts getting kicked around with f6. If very often white's knight will come to e4, gets kicked around by f5. So black has the initiative here, and as well as that, it has the same problem as a Marshall Gambit. Not quite as much theory, but still a significant body of theory, and theoretically, white has failed to prove anything. So after castle, those were two of the main approaches. One of the other main approaches, which I'll be recommending, is a4, and this is the move I've probably played the most in this position out of all of white's options. Of course, I've tried c3, I've tried h3, but a4 is a move I've come back to time and again.
Yeah.
And very logical move, yeah.
Yeah. Pressure against b5.
Yeah.
Black must react. Bishop b7 or b4, probably critical moves.
I mean, we've seen this idea. We see this idea very often in these Spanish positions. Black has weakened his structure early on, and so we start to ask him uncomfortable questions. He has two approaches. One is to play b4. The other is to play bishop b7. Both these moves have pluses and minuses. The advantage of playing bishop b7 is that you don't weaken the c4 square, for example. So you don't fix your pawn structure. On the other hand, the bishop is considered, if black doesn't play d5, the bishop is considered slightly misplaced on this diagonal. And here after, for example, d3 and d6. Okay, and d5 is considered a worse version with the pawn on a4.
Yeah.
Because white has the option of a takes b5 and rook takes a8, relieving a lot of pressure and possibly distracting black's pieces on a8. And after d6, your bishop very often wants to get back to e6.
To neutralize the white's bishop b3.
So that is the downside of playing bishop b7.
Well, by the way, d3 is usually a good move when black plays bishop b7. Can one say that in general, or is that too general? I mean,
I wouldn't say it's too general, no.
Yeah.
If the bishop is on b7,
this pawn chain.
It's quite good to blunt his bishop. It's a bit of a slower approach for white, of course. We're not trying to get the center immediately, but in the anti-Marshall, you don't try to get the center immediately. You try to develop your pieces with c3, knight d2, knight f1, knight g3, or knight e3 sometimes, slowly. And
only then d4.
After you get the knight to g3, then you start to think about d4. So first of all, b4. So as I mentioned, this move weakens the c4 square and fixes black's pawn structure. The plus side is that the pawn on b4 is actually rather annoying for white.
Yeah, I want to go to c3 with my knight.
Yeah,
but I'm not allowed. Yeah.
You wouldn't. Yeah. You would love to have this square in many cases, but you can't go there anymore. So this pawn actually is kind of cramping white. And again, here white has different approaches. One of the approaches is to play a5. which is a typical idea, and we'll see this later on. And a5 is a purely positional move. It just fixes the weakness on a6. And, of course, right now, it might sound a bit funny to call it a weakness.
Yeah.
But in a lot of endgames, this ends up being a weak pawn, and white has a natural way to attack this pawn, which right now it's, of course, over-defended, but more often than not, this pawn could become a weakness.
So, and a6 in general is weaker than white's pawn on a5, which also looks, I mean, I see ideas rook b8, rook b5, stuff like that.
This is always a question.
Yeah.
Right? Sometimes black does achieve this.
Yeah.
But black can only really achieve this after the trade of bishops. Because if your rook goes to b5, very often you get hit with bishop c4, bishop a4, and taking on a5, yeah, you win a pawn. But sometimes your rook gets trapped there. It happens very often that, you play rook b5, bishop a4 comes, and you can't play rook takes a5 because suddenly there's like knight d2, knight c4 attacking the rook.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't get it back. So a5 and, for example, d6, d3, and bishop b6, or rook b8 and bishop b6 is one approach. It's a big theoretical position. White has tried different approaches here. Sometimes white plays knight d2 and puts the knight on c4. Sometimes white plays knight d2, puts the bishop on c4, and the knight on b3, asking black, do you want to take or not? These days, it's very common to take on e6, and then try to play c3 and d4. Or sometimes more slowly, knight d2, knight b3 or c4, and eventually d4. And this position has been played a lot at the top. But it's not considered that white is really better. I mean, there are games where you could study where white did well. For example, Wesley So against Levin Aronian in the last candidates. White won an excellent game. Or Magnus himself has experimented with this line a lot against Aronian.
As black.
Oh, also as black. I mean, as Magnus is a martial player, he's played this position on both sides. And I had a game in this structure against him where I took and I played knight d2, and eventually it ended in a draw.
But here, I mean, for example, you mentioned the idea rook b8, rook b5. I mean, after the trade of bishops.
That also happens. There are games I remember, like I think Wojtaszek, or maybe it was Adams Wojtaszek, where black played rook b8, rook b5, and that is an idea. Sometimes though the rook on b5, you don't really threaten to take on a5 because your rook is
as you mentioned.
I think there are some lines like I might not be remembering correctly, but like knight d2, rook b8, c3, rook b5, and then c4 is an option. And black goes back because if you take on a5, rook b1.
That's nice.
That's
nice. Rook b1 is cool.
Yeah. and your rook on a5
that's a cool
not
move.
fully trapped, but it has to go some weird squares.
Yeah, rook b1.
But anyway, this is not the line I'm recommending. Although I think it's an interesting line to look into, and there are a lot of games, very instructive games, and it leads to kind of fighting play, so it's always an option. But I like the line d4. And I'll just go back a moment. There's a move d4 here. But in general, this line where, like for example, there's stuff like this, it's much better for black to have the pawn on b5. Because, first of all, c4 is not a weakness, and sometimes black can try to get c5, c4 himself, we saw this in other lines where c5 happens and the bishop gets trapped. That is a big theoretical position as well. But here, it's sort of a better version for white. Or at least it's considered these days to be a better version. Especially after knight takes d4. Here white has the tactic bishop takes f7. Rook f7, knight e5. This is attacked and this is attacked. And
did this work in the other line as well?
It's a line in the other line. But there, after, for example, rook f8, queen d4, it's a different story with the pawn on a2 and b5. Here white has the c4 square. And so there black, I think, plays with some compensation for the sacrificed pawn. And that is, as well, a theoretical debate. But here it's...
simply bad, yeah?
I'm actually threatening queen c4 in many cases. In this position, for example, if you go back now you have 2 pieces for the rook. It all looks great, but you're lacking 1 tempo. E5, and wherever your knight goes, it doesn't have many places to go. I have queen f3, picking up the rook. So here I'm winning. That's why after d4, and by the way, if e takes d4, e5 is really strong. The knight is forced to go back to e8. And here I'm sure that white has more than one approach. Although I wouldn't be surprised if this simple way is good. And again, it's a different story. You know, here if black plays c5 at any moment, c4 is no longer an idea, so the bishop on b3 is kind of entrenched in the position, and white has a space advantage, and the knight on e8 is misplaced. So after d4, d6 is basically considered forced, and this move is exclusively played at the top level.
Yeah.
Again, white has different moves here, but black is kind of threatening bishop g4. So the best move is to clarify the central tension. And here black has a choice. In both cases, we get very, very similar positions with some subtle differences.
Mm-hmm.
And this is kind of an interesting moment because black's 2 approaches are both considered kind of equivalent, theoretically. Like they're very different moves, and they lead to different types, similar but kind of different types of positions. But theoretically, they're both considered pretty much equivalent. So for black, it's a matter of taste. In both cases, we get a symmetrical structure on the king side, and a sort of asymmetrical structure on the queen side, where because of this, black has a weak c4 square, and very often we play a5 to target the a6 pawn in the endgame. Again, not a clear weakness for the moment, but long term it is a weakness. On the other hand, because of this b4 pawn, which controls c3, black has d4 as an outpost. So for example, after d takes e5, very often the knight comes into d4. For white to cover the square, you would have to play c3, and c3 liquidates the queen side and has its own tactical problems in some positions.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a sort of a fight between different squares. White tries to utilize the c4 square, and usually you do this by playing knight d2 and then either knight c4, or sometimes if you play a5, then it's more natural to play bishop c4 and knight b3.
Does white want the queens off or on? I mean, difficult.
Difficult to say for sure.
Yeah.
It depends on the position.
Yeah.
I will actually be advocating for an approach which keeps the queens on.
Mm-hmm.
Because white has a choice here. In general, white can play, for example, bishop g5, or white can allow the trade with queen d8 or something. All of which are reasonable moves. But I like the option of keeping the queens on, and this is the move that I'll be recommending here.
Also in general, by the way?
Well, yeah, and in fact, most of the lines I've recommended do keep the queens on for the most part.
Mm.
For example, in the Berlin, we had an option. Do we go for the endgame?
Yeah.
Or not? Yeah, there aren't many lines which lead to an immediate exchange of queens. I can't say that trading queens is a bad idea, but I like this line. It keeps a lot of tension in the position. This is actually an enormously complex position because, as you can see, only a pair of pawns has been traded. And it's very likely that this will remain. Very often the pieces just remain on the board here, or maybe an exchange of minor pieces. But the queens will stay on for a long time in this line, because here we're not going to move our knight until after we play queen e2. So what are our ideas here? An ideal world, of course knight c4 is an idea, but in an ideal world we'll try to get a5, queen e2, as I said, bishop c4, knight b3. Suddenly you see we're bearing down on this pawn, and he no longer can move any of the pieces defending it. Then bishop e3 in some cases. We'll get the d file, and we'll also be attacking this c5 square. If we have an option of playing bishop d5, if the square is not defended by 2 pieces, it's very often a tactical idea, because if he takes, we take back with the pawn attacking the knight, and e5 is very weak. So black struggles with the weakness of e5, and very often with the weakness of the long-term weakness of a6. Also, as a tactical point, I should mention that a5 does sometimes open up the possibility of bishop a4, and the knight on c6 might become overloaded. Another positional point that I should mention, like I said, the knight on d4, knight very often comes to d4 because black does have this square as like a semi-outpost here. To combat that, we would love to restrict this knight. So if we got the chance to play a5, for example, in this position, to play a5, queen e2, and then c3, this is very actually a good thing for us. He takes, we take back. We have to watch out for the tactics here because there are, the b file is opened and things like that. But after c3 and after a5, the knight on c6, and we'll see this in various positions, but I could also, let's say if black were to play king h8, a5, king g8, and we were to play c3, take. Now you noticed, okay, black wasted 2 tempting, but the knight on c6 has nowhere to go.
Yeah.
It can't go to a5, it can't go to d4, so it is sort of an awkward piece, it just remains on c6, and it would love to be on some other square like c5, for example, but it can't get there. Now, if we were, after king h8, to play c3 immediately, this is a different story. Because black could, for example, take and knight a5.
Use the square.
And, okay, here it might run into knight takes e5, but the knight on a5, it's also sort of a semi-outpost. It can't be chased away by anything, really. White doesn't have a b pawn to play b4. You wouldn't call it a great outpost because it's on the rim, but it exerts some influence. It attacks the bishop here. If the bishop moves and the knight moves, it can come to c4. Anyway, just some positional ideas to be aware of. After knight d2, there are a lot of games at the top level, and black almost exclusively plays bishop c5.
Very logical, yeah.
It's a very logical move, yeah. Your bishop was passive on e7, now it's active, and it attacks f2. Some other moves that are important. Bishop g4, for example, is an important move. It's logical as well. We've seen this pin before. But here it gets kicked back. If he takes, we can take back with the knight. And black cannot win a pawn. I think we've seen this tactic in the bishop c5, the Arkhangelisk, especially.
After rook d8, just bishop moves. And
Yeah,
then,
if rook d8,
bishop e3, yeah.
bishop e3, and black will have to sack the exchange to save his piece. So obviously, if he doesn't take the pawn, he doesn't lose material. Yeah, but for example, rook d8, bishop e3 should be a fine move. And black is left without the bishop pair. And by the way, here, we'll notice...
a6, yeah.
Yeah. Let's say if it's my move, I take on d8. I don't care about the d file. Take on d8, a5, bishop c4, bishop a6, attacking this pawn. So black here is much worse. If instead, after h3, black goes back, we're absolutely happy to play g4. This doesn't concern us at all. First of all, the sacrifice, take, might look a bit scary, but this is a very well-defended knight, and after c3, important move, we stop knight d4. Take. He doesn't actually... He has 2 pawns, but that's...
No follow-up with f5 or stuff like that.
F5 you can't really achieve,
because
it's pinned.
Yeah.
And, king h8...
No.
Yeah, I mean, if you try to prepare this, for example, it's not... You're still not attacking this knight. I mean, queen e4, your attack is done. And by the way, I also kind of threaten knight f1 next because...
You can retake with bishop on d1.
Recapture with the bishop on d1. So black is kind of forced to go back to g6, and you might think f4 is a weakness, but black is not exploiting this weakness. And after knight h4, for example, I can even eliminate this bishop. This is not the first move which comes to my mind, but I checked it, and this is actually the best move. Because once white takes this, it looks like we have some dark square weaknesses, but black doesn't exploit it. And actually, it's this bishop which is unopposed in the position. And just completely dominates black's light squares. For example, after knight d4, take bishop c4. We're going to follow up with c3, kick his knight back, knight f3, attacking this pawn. And then you can see after knight f3, for example, white might play knight g5, attacking f7, and this bishop is really a monster on c4. That's why after knight d2, bishop g4 is not considered a very good move. And more often than not in this position, bishop g4 is considered a mistake.
No, after bishop g6, sometimes, usually it doesn't work because but this knight is kind of hanging. I mean, take things like bishop e4, just g5, or what yeah?
Yeah, bishop e4, unfortunately for black, g5.
Yeah,
the knight is often hanging, so it's important to be aware of this. This bishop takes h4, discovery in some positions. Here it doesn't work because after knight takes e4 as well, knight takes g6, take, and I win the piece. So tactics are not working for black. So after knight d2, bishop g4 is not considered a great move. Black can also, for example, play a5. The move is logical. Black doesn't want to be saddled with a weakness on a6, so he moves his pawn.
But you get a new square weakness, maybe.
Yeah.
b5,
No, this is actually a relevant weakness.
Yeah.
After queen e2, for example, we're already threatening queen b5, attacking the knight and the pawn d5. And black has to start making awkward moves to defend this. And then after he wastes time, we are happy to play knight c4, or, as well, another option, bishop c4, bishop b5. Another square for not just for the queen, but for the bishop.
After bishop a6, you play bishop c4, I think?
Here I'm happy to play bishop c4.
Yeah, and then lovely
take,
light squared control.
I developed with tempo,
Yeah.
and now e5 is hanging, and if you play bishop d6 defending, bishop g5, an important pin to be aware of. Once the bishop moves, this is an option. h6, bishop h4. And yeah, you could play g5 here. By the way, this is also probably quite a good position for white because this knight on c4 is, like, for example, rook ed1, rook d5. White has tremendous light square control, and this is bad bishop. Also, bishop h4 keeps the pin, and at g5, even this position, yeah, the bishop is a bit misplaced, but, black's f5 square is chronically weak. The trade of bishops, especially if we gain a tempo with it, is usually a plus for white. So after knight d2, that's why bishop c5 is the main move. Another thing I should mention is that bishop on b7 is not a great piece. It doesn't belong here. It's kind of restricted by this knight on c6, and for example, if we play a5, where's the knight going? As well as other moves here. I'm sure that, for example, c3 is going to be quite a good move, or queen e2. Here it's probably a matter of taste, but in general the bishop on b7 is misplaced. So bishop c5, and this position has a lot of high-level games. In the past, white would usually play queen e2, and this was, for example, the way that games such as Grishuk, Sweedler, very high-level encounters like that went. White just wants to play queen e2, c3, knight c4, and something like that. But the way I played in 2013, was a5. And at the time, this was a novelty, at least in over-the-board chess. And it's a very logical move. And I'm actually a bit surprised that it was a novelty at the time. So I'm stopping knight a5, and I'm just getting the structure, which in general we're happy with. My next move will be queen e2 and then c3. Here, so after I played a5, it kind of exploded in popularity, and it's been played many, many times since. Top players like Wesley have played it recently as well. Here, black does have to act fast. Again, if you play bishop b7, and I'm allowed time to play c3, queen e2 is also a good move, played by Modulev. But in this case, I'm just recommending c3. Take.
Knight c6. Okay, problem piece.
And if I'm given another tempo to play bishop c4, or queen e2, knight b3, and again, bishop c4, queen e2 targets this a pawn. An important sequence of moves to remember. We should always be wary of the queen coming to d3, attacking c3. But here, I'm even happy with the endgame. Queen c2, take. And this a6 pawn will be a long-term weakness in the endgame. Knight c4 is coming, e5 will be weak, and then you can consider bishop a4 attacking this knight. Black struggles with his knight on c6. And in general, it feels like a lack of space because of this. If I were to put the pawn on a4, black's knight on a5, and black's rook on e8, it would feel like a whole different position. Suddenly, it would feel like black is not cramped and has a knight which is not awkwardly placed on c6. So, as I mentioned, bishop e7 in general, not a good square for the bishop.
Well, the first move, I didn't mentioning it, but is the first move to be afraid of, I think, as white as knight g4. And,
yeah.
Because I would have considered h3 a bit, but...
yeah, so, no, h3 is also a theoretical move.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, knight g4 here, because,
Knight g4 is one of the moves which has been played by Ronian, for example, quite a lot. The thing is, after rook f1, we're ready to play h3. In general, we're not afraid of him taking on f2 because, let's say he were to take immediately. We have the two pieces,
there's
and
no follow-up.
They're two very good pieces. And we're going to follow up with, for example, queen e2 and knight c4. And the two pieces are going to be much stronger in this position. Black's, I think it's not important to think about the material balance. Two pieces against rook and pawn is, I guess, sort of equivalent by the numbers. But look at Black's rook on a8 compared to our minor pieces. Knight jumping to c4, bishop to e3 or g5, bishop to d5 now is a threat because he's no longer covering the square. White is the one with the serious advantage and initiative. So after rook f1, Aronian, for example, went back, and he did this more than once. And it's a valid idea. He's just asking white, is there a better move than rook e1? Because of course you can repeat with white, but we're looking for more. The thing for black is that he doesn't have very useful moves. With a knight on g4, suddenly there's bishop d5 ideas. So if like queen e7, I hit you with bishop d5. And this pin is very annoying. That's why he goes back and asks white, which move do you want to make? So queen e2 was a choice. For example, Lanier Dominguez. And black played queen e7, bishop c4, bishop g4, and sort of, I guess this was the reason why he wants to provoke the queen to e2. This is a perfectly playable way for white, but I actually like the move bishop c4 immediately instead. And I plan a simple knight b3 next. I'll be happy to trade queens, and as usual e4 is not hanging because of bishop d5 tricks. So queen e7 was how one game went. White played knight b3. Knight takes e4 runs into queen d5. Everything hanging. The bishop is attacked, so black went back bishop d6, and then white played rook e1, and I feel like white already is consolidated. The knight on b3, bishop on c4 is really a good setup for us.
And now after knight g4 you go rook e2 probably.
Well, knight g4 no longer attacks.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. We can cut that out.
So white will just continue with queen e2, and by the way, bishop g5 is an idea, because we pin the knight and then maybe bishop d5, or we can play h3, bishop e3, c3. Now that we've been given time to consolidate, black really is lacking ideas, especially after queen e2. If I'm making one more move, rook d8, queen e2, just notice that this pawn, okay, I'm not threatening it, but you can't move your bishop anywhere good. You can't play bishop g4 because it's hanging. You can't play rook b8. So you're tied down. Your knight on c6 has nowhere to go to besides b8, and you don't want to go there. Your bishop on d6 has no moves. You're really cramped here.
Yeah, you mentioned the ideal world before some moves ago, and
this is pretty much the ideal world. So we can see that it's not that difficult. Black didn't really make any serious mistakes. He made all natural moves, and he ended up in a bad position. So knight g4, it's a playable move, but I don't really see it as... I don't think that this is threatening us very much if he goes back and forth. So in the initial game when I played a5, my opponent, Tomi Niebach, a very strong grandmaster, played queen e7. I think this is a natural way of playing. Black wants to play rook d8. He wants to develop naturally. There's a tactical problem with this move, which is the bishop d5.
Also mentioned by you. Once this square is not controlled by two pieces.
Once black plays queen e7, or once black moves the knight, bishop d5 happens. Taking, and e5 will fall. Black can't do that. My opponent played bishop b7. Now I played knight b3, so I'm attacking, developing and attacking with tempo. Now this is hanging, and one of white's ideas is queen d3, queen c4, putting pressure on c5, putting pressure on c6. Another idea is to play bishop g5. For example, if black is to go bishop d6, I go bishop g5, and now you're pinned everywhere. This is a pin, and this is a pin. And after h6, bishop h4, if g5, I think that this is already a very strong way of playing. Knight takes g5, hg5, bishop g5, to be followed up with rook e3, rook g3, or queen f3. A lot of threats, and black has no way to break this pin, except, I guess, slowly with queen d8, but then rook e3 will come, and or here as well.
Yeah.
If I play rook e3, you're going to be, well, first of all, rook f3 is an enormous threat, rook g3. You're going to be hard-pressed to survive this one. So, that's why after knight b3, my opponent played bishop a7, keeping the bishop on the active diagonal. I played bishop g5. He played h6 to break the pin. Here, bishop h4 tactically was not working quite as well after g5. It no longer really works to take on g5, because, well, especially black has this d6 square. Now the pin is not really eternal, so he can break the pin with queen d6. So I took. I gave up the bishop pair, but now my bishop on d5 is really hard to get rid of.
Monster.
Queen d3. Now suddenly queen c4 is an idea. He played rook e8, queen c4. You can see black is lacking moves, and this is a very uncomfortable pin. I mean, yeah, I'm not attacking the knight directly right now, but you can't really move it. Knight d8 will lose the c7 pawn, or the b4 pawn. And you have to find a move, because I might play knight c5 next. I might at some point consider taking and just grabbing your pawn on b4. He played rook b8. And here I played h3. I think I felt like there was unlimited time. I just wanted to give some loot for my king in the future. But it was actually stronger to play rook d1. And the reason is that this stops knight d4, and in the game he played knight d4. And we reached a position like this, which I felt should be positionally much better for white, but is actually quite difficult. His pawns, yeah, they look kind of fixed, but they're not really fixed. Like he's playing somewhere b3, maybe d3 is an idea with b2 hanging. Rook b5, and his bishop, if it gets active, is very strong. I eventually won this position, but it's not clear. And that's why it was better to prevent knight d4 by playing rook d1. And now if he plays knight d4, I just take d4 twice and win a pawn. For example, knight d4, take back, take on b7, and knight takes d4. And so here black is, it's not like he has a horrible position. He's not losing immediately or anything, but I have pressure. You don't have an easy move to make. And so next I'll play rook d3, h3, useful move, rook d1, and I'll continue to up the pressure slowly. And that's why queen e7 here, or in other versions, usually runs into bishop d5 with strong pressure for it. Important to remember, bishop d5, knight b3.
Okay.